The key felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands as I stood before the massive barn doors. 18 years of questions finally about to be answered. The lawyer, Marie Cook, had driven 3 hours from the city just to hand me this single brass key and a letter that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Behind those weathered wooden doors lay the secret my grandmother had kept locked away for decades. And I was about to discover why she had chosen me, the grandson she never met, to inherit her entire farm. The morning I aged out of Riverside Children's Home, I had exactly $237 to my name, a duffel bag of clothes that had seen better days, and absolutely no idea what came next. Most kids in my situation end up couch surfing or finding themselves on the streets within the first few months. I had been preparing for that reality, steeling myself for the harsh transition from institutional care to complete independence. What I never expected was Marie Cook showing up at the front desk, asking for Larry Sanchez. I remember walking down those familiar hallways one last time, past the rooms where I had spent countless nights, wondering if anyone out there was looking for me. The walls were painted that institutional beige that somehow manages to be both cheerful and depressing at the same time. Mrs. Henderson, the house mother, who had been there since I was 12, gave me a hug that lasted longer than usual. She pressed a $20 bill into my hand and whispered that I was going to be just fine. I wanted to believe her, but 18 years of being nobody's first choice had taught me to keep my expectations low. Marie Cook was waiting in the administrative office, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that somehow felt warm rather than cold. She introduced herself as the executor of my grandmother's estate, and those words hit me like a physical blow. Grandmother. I had a grandmother. More than that, I had a grandmother who had known about me, who had been thinking about me, who had left me something. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The drive to Millfield took us through countryside I had never seen before. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and barns that looked like they had been standing for generations. Marie explained that my grandmother, Jacqueline Jones, had owned a 200-acre farm about 60 miles outside the city. She had never married, never had children of her own, but she had been my father's mother. My father, who had died when I was 3 months old. My father, whose name I barely knew and whose face I had never seen. Jacqueline had been estranged from her son for years before his death, Marie told me. Some kind of falling out over his lifestyle choices, his addiction struggles, his inability to settle down. She had never known about me until after he died, and by then I was already in the system. She had tried to gain custody, but the courts had deemed her too old, too set in her ways, too isolated on her farm to properly care for a young child. So she had watched from a distance, receiving updates through a private investigator, making sure I was safe but never interfering directly. The revelation that someone had been watching over me, even from afar, was almost too much of the process. I had spent my entire childhood creating elaborate fantasies about family members who might be looking for me, relatives who would one day show up and take me home. As I got older, those fantasies had faded into cynical acceptance that I was truly alone in the world. Now, sitting in the passenger seat of Marie's sedan, I learned that the fantasy had been partially true all along. We turned down a gravel driveway lined with oak trees that must have been planted decades ago. The farmhouse came into view first, a 2-story white structure with a wraparound porch and green shutters. It looked exactly like the kind of house I used to imagine when I was little, the kind of place where families gathered for Sunday dinners and kids played in the yard until their mothers called them in for supper. Behind the house stood the barn, massive and imposing, with doors that were secured by a heavy chain and an old padlock. Marie parked the car and we walked up the front steps together. She had been maintaining the property since Jacqueline's death 6 months earlier, making sure everything was ready for the day I turned 18 and could legally inherit. The front door opened to reveal hardwood floors and furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts of a life I had never known. Family photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, and I found myself staring at images of people who shared my features, my dark hair, my stubborn jawline. In the largest photograph, a woman who could only be my grandmother stood next to a man I recognized with a shock as my father. He looked younger than I had ever imagined him, maybe 20 years old, wearing work clothes and a genuine smile. Jacqueline had her arm around his shoulders, and they both looked happy. Whatever had driven them apart had not yet happened when that picture was taken. Marie handed me a thick envelope with my name written across the front in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that began with the words I had been waiting my entire life to hear. My dear Larry, it started. I know you must have many questions, and I pray that someday I will have the chance to answer them in person. If you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and I can only hope that I have left you something that will help you understand where you come from and who you are meant to be. The letter went on to explain that my father, Daniel, had been the light of her life until addiction took hold of him in his early 20s. She had tried everything to help him, interventions and treatment programs and tough love, but nothing had worked. Their final argument had been about money he had stolen from her to buy drugs, and she had told him never to come back until he was clean. He had died 3 weeks later in a car accident, and she had carried the guilt of those harsh words for the rest of her life. She wrote about learning of my existence through the obituary, about the private investigator she had hired to find me, about the court battles she had lost trying to bring me home. She described watching me from a distance at school events and soccer games, proud of the young man I was becoming, but heartbroken that she could not be part of my life. The letter was 8 pages long, filled with observations about my character, my resilience, my kindness to younger children at the home. She had been watching more closely than I ever could have imagined. The final page contained instructions about the barn. She explained that she had locked it up after my father's death, unable to bear the memories it contained. Everything inside had belonged to him, his workshop, his projects, his dreams for the future that addiction had stolen away. She had never been able to bring herself to clean it out, but she wanted me to have it all. The key to the barn was in a small wooden box on her dresser upstairs, along with one more surprise that she hoped would help me understand my heritage. I climbed the stairs to her bedroom with Marie following quietly behind me. The room was simple but comfortable, with a quilt on the bed that looked handmade and photographs covering every surface. The wooden box sat exactly where the letter had promised, containing the brass key and a birth certificate that took my breath away. It was my father's birth certificate, listing his full name as Daniel Brooks Sanchez and his father as Benjamin Clark, a name I had never heard before. Below that was another document, a marriage certificate showing that my grandmother had been married briefly in her 20s to this Benjamin Clark, making her Jacqueline Clark for exactly 11 months before the marriage ended in divorce. The implications hit me immediately. I was not just Larry Sanchez, the abandoned orphan with no family history. I was Larry Sanchez Clark, connected to 2 family lines I had never known existed. Marie explained that Benjamin Clark had been a local man, a farmer like his father before him, and that many of the Clark family still lived in the area. My father had grown up knowing his extended family, had been part of a community that I was only now discovering. We walked to the barn together, the key feeling heavier with each step. The chain fell away easily, and the doors swung open to reveal a space that had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating workbenches covered with tools and half-finished projects. A vintage motorcycle sat in one corner, partially disassembled, but clearly loved. Hand-carved wooden furniture filled another section, pieces that showed real skill and artistry. This had been my father's sanctuary, the place where he had created beautiful things before addiction consumed his life. I walked through the space slowly, running my hands over surfaces my father had touched, trying to connect with this man I had never known. Marie stood in the doorway, giving me space to process the overwhelming emotions flooding through me. On one of the workbenches, I found a wooden cradle that was nearly finished, sanded smooth but not yet stained. A piece of paper tucked underneath revealed plans for a nursery, sketches of furniture and decorations drawn in my father's careful hand. He had been planning for my arrival, preparing to be the kind of father he had never had himself. The discovery of that cradle broke something open inside me that I had kept carefully locked away for 18 years. I sat down on an old stool and let myself cry for the father I had lost, for the grandmother who had loved me from a distance, for all the years we could have had together if circumstances had been different. Marie waited patiently while I grieved, understanding that this moment was necessary before I could move forward. When I finally composed myself, she explained the practical details of my inheritance. The farm was mine free and clear, along with a modest savings account that Jacqueline had maintained for my education or whatever I chose to do with my life. There were also connections in the community, people who had known my father and grandmother, who might be willing to help me learn how to manage the property. She handed me a list of names and phone numbers, starting with Kyle Ruiz, who had been my father's best friend and now ran the feed store in town. The decision to stay was not an easy one. I had been accepted to community college and had planned to study automotive repair, a practical skill that would guarantee employment anywhere. The farm represented a completely different path, one that required knowledge I did not possess and connections I had never made. But standing in that barn, surrounded by evidence of my father's creativity and my grandmother's love, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt like I belonged somewhere. Marie helped me move my few possessions into the farmhouse that evening. We uncovered the furniture and opened the windows to let fresh air circulate through rooms that had been closed for too long. The kitchen was fully stocked with canned goods and basic supplies, as if Jacqueline had been preparing for my arrival right up until the end. Her clothes still hung in the closet, and I found myself breathing in the faint scent of lavender that clung to everything she had owned. That first night alone in the house was both peaceful and terrifying. I had never lived anywhere without the constant background noise of other people, the shuffle of footsteps in hallways, and muffled conversations through thin walls. The silence of the countryside was profound, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of wind through the trees. I lay in the bed that had been my grandmother's, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. The next morning, I drove into Millfield proper for the first time, a town of maybe 3,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The main street was lined with businesses that looked like they had been there for generations, family-owned shops with hand-painted signs and windows full of merchandise that catered to farming and rural life. I parked outside Ruiz Feed and Supply, took a deep breath, and walked through the front door to meet the first person who had known my father. Kyle Ruiz was a man in his 40s with calloused hands and a direct gaze that sized me up immediately. When I introduced myself as Daniel's son, his entire demeanor changed. He came around the counter and pulled me into a hug that caught me completely off guard, the kind of embrace that spoke of genuine affection and long-held grief. He told me he had been wondering when I would show up, that he had been hoping for years that someone would bring life back to the old Jones place. We talked for over an hour that first morning, Kyle sharing stories about my father that painted a picture of a young man who had been talented and kind, but ultimately unable to overcome his demons. He described fishing trips and camping expeditions, projects they had worked on together, dreams they had shared about the future. He also spoke honestly about the addiction that had slowly destroyed my father's relationships and eventually cost him his life. It was painful to hear, but I needed to understand the whole truth about where I came from. Kyle offered to help me learn the basics of farm management, explaining that the land had been leased to a neighboring farmer for the past several years, but that I could take it back whenever I was ready. He introduced me to Donald Robinson, who owned the adjacent property and had been maintaining my grandmother's fields in exchange for the right to harvest the crops. Donald was a quiet man in his 60s who had known 3 generations of my family and seemed genuinely pleased to meet the fourth. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning everything I could about farming, about the land I had inherited, about the community I was slowly becoming part of. Donald taught me to recognize different soil conditions and understand crop rotation. Kyle showed me how to maintain equipment and budget for seasonal expenses. Other neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves and share memories of my grandmother, each conversation adding another piece to the puzzle of my family history. The barn became my sanctuary, just as it had been for my father. I spent hours there working on the projects he had left unfinished, learning to use tools I had never touched before, discovering that I had inherited his steady hands and eye for detail. The motorcycle was my first major challenge, a 1973 Honda that needed a complete engine rebuild. I bought repair manuals and watched online tutorials, slowly bringing the machine back to life piece by piece. As summer turned to fall, I made the decision to take back control of the farming operation. Donald helped me understand the financial aspects, the costs and potential profits, the risks and rewards of different crops. We planted winter wheat that first season, a relatively simple crop that would give me time to learn without too much complexity. I bought a used tractor and basic implements, spending my inheritance carefully but confidently. The physical work was harder than anything I had ever done, but it felt right in a way that nothing else ever had. There was satisfaction in watching seeds I had planted emerge from the soil, in seeing the fields turn green with new growth. I was creating something, contributing to something larger than myself, continuing a tradition that stretched back generations. For the first time in my life, I felt truly useful. Winter brought challenges I had not anticipated. The farmhouse was old and drafty, requiring constant attention to keep warm. Pipes froze despite my best efforts, and I learned to thaw them with a hairdryer while cursing my inexperience. The isolation was profound during the coldest months, with snow making the roads nearly impassable for days at a time. I began to understand why my grandmother had lived such a solitary life, and I gained new respect for her strength and independence. But winter also brought unexpected connections. Heather Wilson, who ran the local diner, started setting aside meals for me when she knew I had been working late in the fields. Sharon Mitchell, the librarian, helped me research agricultural techniques and connected me with extension services that could provide expert advice. Laura White, who taught at the elementary school, invited me to speak to her class about modern farming methods, giving me a chance to share what I was learning with the next generation. These women, along with the men who had become my informal mentors, created a network of support I had never experienced before. They checked on me during storms, offered advice when I encountered problems, and included me in community events where I slowly learned the rhythms of small-town life. I attended church suppers and volunteer fire department fundraisers, gradually moving from outsider to neighbor to friend. Spring brought the validation I had been hoping for. The wheat crop emerged strong and healthy, a sea of green that stretched across fields my great-grandfather had first plowed decades earlier. I stood at the edge of that field one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and felt a connection to the land that went deeper than ownership. This was where I belonged, where my family had belonged, where future generations might belong if I could build something lasting. The motorcycle was finally ready for its first ride that spring, the engine purring with the smooth power my father had originally built into it. I took it out on the country roads, feeling the wind and sun and experiencing a joy that I imagined my father had felt on these same roads years before. The machine was his gift to me across the years, a tangible connection to the man I was slowly getting to know through his possessions and the stories others shared. As my first full year on the farm drew to a close, I began planning for the future with confidence I had never possessed before. I researched crop diversification, considering soybeans and corn to add variety to my operation. I sketched plans for updating the barn, adding modern conveniences while preserving its historic character. I even began thinking about the possibility of raising livestock, continuing the mixed farming tradition that had sustained my family for generations. The community had fully accepted me by then, no longer seeing me as the orphan boy who had inherited the Jones place, but as Larry Clark, farmer and neighbor. The name change had been Kyle's suggestion, honoring both sides of my heritage while establishing my place in the local family networks that went back generations. I was no longer just passing through or trying to fit in. I was home. One evening in late autumn, I found myself back in the barn, working on a new project inspired by my father's unfinished cradle. I was building a dining room table, something large enough to seat the family I hoped to have someday, sturdy enough to last for generations. As I worked, I thought about all the unexpected turns my life had taken since that morning when Marie Cook had appeared at the children's home with a key and a letter. The harvest that second year exceeded all my expectations, both in terms of yield and personal satisfaction. I had learned to read the weather patterns, to time the planting and harvesting for optimal results, to work with the natural rhythms of the land rather than against them. Donald helped me negotiate contracts with grain elevators, teaching me the business side of farming that was just as important as the agricultural knowledge. When the checks arrived, I realized I had not just survived my first full year as a farmer, I had actually turned a profit. With success came new challenges and opportunities. The farm adjacent to mine came up for sale when the elderly owner decided to move to town, and Kyle suggested I consider expanding my operation. It was a big decision, requiring a substantial loan and a leap of faith in my own abilities. But I had learned to trust my instincts, and everything told me this was the right move at the right time. The bank meeting was intimidating, sitting across from loan officers who held my future in their hands. But I had prepared thoroughly, with crop projections and financial statements and references from every farmer in the county who knew my work. When they approved the loan, I felt a pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen as a serious businessman worthy of investment. Expanding the farm meant hiring help during busy seasons, and I found myself becoming an employer and mentor to young people from town who needed work. Some were high school students earning money for college. Others were young adults trying to find their direction in life. I remembered being 18 and lost, and I tried to provide the kind of guidance and opportunity I wish someone had given me. One of those young workers was a girl named Jessica, a recent high school graduate whose family had farmed for generations before losing their land in a bad year. She had an intuitive understanding of agriculture that reminded me of myself, and a work ethic that impressed even Donald. When she mentioned wanting to study agricultural science but lacking the money for college, I offered her a partnership arrangement that would allow her to work her way through school while gaining practical experience on my farm. The arrangement worked beautifully for everyone involved. Jessica brought fresh ideas and energy to the operation, while I provided stability and resources she could not have accessed on her own. We developed new crop rotations that improved soil health while increasing yields. We invested in precision agriculture technology that allowed us to farm more efficiently and sustainably. Together, we were building something neither of us could have achieved alone. As my third year on the farm began, I realized I had accomplished something I never thought possible. I had created a home, not just a place to live, but a true foundation for a life worth living. The farmhouse was no longer a museum to my grandmother's memory, but a living space filled with my own possessions and memories. The barn had become a workshop where I created furniture and repaired equipment, carrying on my father's tradition while making it my own. The community had embraced me completely, involving me in decisions about local issues and trusting me with responsibilities that came with being an established resident. I served on the school board and volunteered with the fire department, giving back to the place that had given me so much. When newcomers arrived in town, I was often the one asked to help them find their footing, just as others had done for me. Looking back now, 5 years after that first day, when Marie Cook handed me the key to my inheritance, I understand that what my grandmother left me was much more than land and buildings. She gave me the chance to discover who I was meant to be, to find my place in a community and a tradition that stretched back generations. She gave me the opportunity to transform from an abandoned child into a man with roots and purpose and a future worth building. The letter I found tucked away in my father's workshop during my fourth year on the farm revealed the final piece of the puzzle I had been trying to solve. It was written in his handwriting, addressed to me but never sent, dated just weeks before his death. In it, he wrote about his struggles with addiction, his regret over the pain he had caused his mother, and his desperate hope that someday he might be worthy of being my father. He described the cradle he was building, the nursery he was planning, the dreams he had for our life together before addiction stole his future. Reading that letter, I finally understood the depth of the tragedy that had shaped my family's history. My father had not been a man who chose drugs over responsibility. He had been a young man fighting a disease he did not understand, trying desperately to overcome demons that were stronger than his love for his family. His death had not been the result of carelessness or selfishness, but the inevitable end of a battle he had been losing for years. That understanding brought a kind of peace I had not expected. Instead of anger at the father who had abandoned me, I felt compassion for the man who had tried so hard to become someone worthy of love. Instead of resentment toward the grandmother who had watched from a distance, I felt gratitude for the woman who had carried the burden of loss and regret while still managing to create something beautiful for me to inherit. The farm had become more than successful by then. Jessica and I had expanded into organic vegetables, selling directly to restaurants in the city and at farmers markets throughout the region. We had developed a reputation for quality and innovation that brought visitors from other farms who wanted to learn our methods. Agricultural extension agents used our operation as an example of how young farmers could build sustainable businesses in rural communities. But success was not measured only in financial terms. The real victory was in the life I had built, the relationships I had formed, the sense of belonging I had discovered. When I walked through town, people called me by name and stopped to chat about weather and crops and local news. When I sat in church on Sunday mornings, I was surrounded by friends who had become family, people who cared about my well-being and celebrated my achievements. The dining room table I had spent months crafting was finally finished. A piece of furniture that would last for generations and anchor the family meals I hoped to host someday. I had learned to cook from scratch, using recipes I found in my grandmother's kitchen and techniques I picked up from neighbors who remembered her cooking. The farmhouse had become a place where people gathered, where stories were shared, where traditions were passed down and new ones were created. As I write this story now, I am 23 years old and engaged to marry Sarah, a teacher from the next county who shares my love for rural life and my commitment to community. We are planning a wedding in the barn where my father once worked, surrounded by the friends who have become our chosen family. The cradle he built for me sits in our future nursery, waiting for the children who will carry on the family name and the farming tradition he started. The key that Marie Cook handed me that day was more than a piece of brass that opened a locked door. It was the key to understanding where I came from, who I was meant to be, and what kind of future I could build with determination and community support. It unlocked not just a barn full of memories, but a life full of possibilities I never could have imagined when I was 18 and alone and convinced that no one in the world cared whether I succeeded or failed. The transformation from orphan teenager to successful farmer and community leader did not happen overnight, and it was not without challenges and setbacks along the way. There were years when crops failed due to weather or disease, when equipment broke down at the worst possible times, when financial pressures made me question whether I was strong enough to continue the legacy my grandmother had entrusted to me. But each challenge taught me something valuable about resilience, about the importance of community support, about the satisfaction that comes from working with your hands to create something meaningful. The relationships I built during those early years became the foundation for everything that followed. Kyle Ruiz remained my closest mentor, the man who taught me that farming was as much about understanding people as it was about understanding soil and weather. Donald Robinson became a second father figure, showing me through his own example what it meant to be a good neighbor and a responsible steward of the land. The women of the community, from Heather at the diner to Sharon at the library to Laura at the school, created a network of support that reminded me daily that I was valued and loved. Jessica's partnership brought new energy and innovation to the farm operation. But more importantly, it taught me the joy of mentoring someone else the way I had been mentored. Watching her grow from an uncertain high school graduate to a confident agricultural entrepreneur reminded me of my own journey and reinforced my commitment to helping other young people find their paths. Together, we created internship programs and educational partnerships that brought students from agricultural colleges to learn sustainable farming techniques on our land. The barn that had once been locked and filled with painful memories became the heart of our operation, a place where past and present came together in productive harmony. We installed modern equipment alongside my father's vintage tools, creating a workspace that honored tradition while embracing innovation. The motorcycle he had rebuilt became a weekend pleasure, taking me on rides through countryside that I now knew intimately, past farms owned by families I considered friends, through communities where I was recognized and welcomed. The farmhouse evolved from a museum of my grandmother's life to a home filled with my own memories and relationships. Sarah and I hosted dinner parties around the table I had built, bringing together farmers and teachers and business owners and retirees in conversations that strengthened the fabric of our rural community. We celebrated holidays with traditions borrowed from families who had adopted us, creating new customs that reflected our unique situation as people who had found family rather than being born into it. As our wedding approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment of happiness and belonging. 5 years earlier, I had been a young man with no past and an uncertain future, carrying everything I owned in a single duffel bag and facing the world alone. Now I was a landowner and businessman, a mentor and community leader, a man with deep roots and strong relationships and a clear sense of purpose. The ceremony took place in the barn on a perfect autumn day, with sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on fields I had planted and tended. Marie Cook was there, the woman who had delivered the key that changed my life, sitting in the front row with tears in her eyes as she watched me marry the woman I loved. Kyle and Donald stood as my groomsmen, representing the father figures who had guided me through my transformation. Jessica served as Sarah's maid of honor, symbolizing the partnerships that had made our success possible. As I spoke my vows to Sarah, I thought about the letter my grandmother had written, about her hope that I would find happiness and belonging in the life she had made possible for me. I thought about my father's unfinished projects and unrealized dreams, about the potential that addiction had stolen from him, but that I had been able to reclaim. I thought about the community that had welcomed a lost young man and helped him become someone worthy of love and respect. Our first year of marriage brought new joys and challenges as we learned to blend our lives and our dreams. Sarah brought her own skills and perspectives to the farm operation, developing educational programs that brought school children to learn about agriculture and environmental stewardship. Her classroom experience proved invaluable as we expanded our internship programs and began hosting workshops for beginning farmers throughout the region. The farm continued to prosper under our joint management, but more importantly, it became a model for how agricultural operations could serve broader community needs. We partnered with local food banks to donate surplus produce, worked with extension services to research sustainable farming practices, and opened our land for educational tours that helped urban visitors understand rural life and farming challenges. When Sarah became pregnant with our first child, I found myself thinking constantly about the cradle my father had built, about the hopes and dreams he had invested in that piece of furniture before addiction destroyed his chance to be a parent. I spent hours in the barn, refinishing the wood and adding safety features that met modern standards, preparing it to hold the fourth generation of my family to grow up on this land. The baby's arrival brought a completeness I had never imagined possible. Holding my son for the first time, I understood the depth of love that had motivated my grandmother to fight for custody, the desperation my father must have felt as he struggled to overcome his addiction, the hope that had sustained them both through years of separation and loss. This child would grow up knowing his family history, understanding where he came from, confident in his place in the world. As my son grew from infant to toddler, I watched him discover the same wonders that had captivated generations of children on this farm. He chased chickens in the yard and helped me feed cattle in the pasture, developing the same connection to the land that had shaped his ancestors. Sarah and I made sure he knew the stories of his great-grandmother Jacqueline and his grandfather Daniel, understanding both the triumphs and tragedies that had led to his existence. The community that had embraced me as a lost teenager now celebrated my son as the newest member of their extended family. He was baptized in the same church where his great-grandmother had worshiped, surrounded by the same families who had welcomed me years earlier. Kyle and Donald competed for the privilege of teaching him to fish and hunt, while Heather and Sharon and Laura spoiled him with attention and treats whenever we visited town. Our success attracted attention from agricultural organizations and rural development groups who wanted to understand how we had built such a thriving operation in an era when many family farms were struggling to survive. We hosted conferences and workshops, sharing our methods and philosophy with farmers from across the region. But we always emphasized that our success was built on community support, on the relationships and partnerships that had sustained us through challenges and celebrated our achievements. As my son approached his second birthday, Sarah and I began planning for our second child, a daughter who would grow up in the same house where her great-grandmother had lived, playing in the same barn where her grandfather had worked, learning the same values of hard work and community service that had sustained our family through generations of joy and sorrow. Looking toward the future, I see endless possibilities for the farm and the community we have helped to strengthen. We are developing plans for agritourism that will bring visitors to experience rural life firsthand, creating new revenue streams while educating people about agriculture and environmental stewardship. We are partnering with universities to research sustainable farming practices that can be replicated on other family farms throughout the region. But beyond the business plans and expansion strategies, I see something more important taking shape. I see a legacy of love and perseverance, of community support and individual determination, of the power that comes from knowing where you belong and who you are meant to be. The key my grandmother left me unlocked more than a barn full of memories. It opened the door to a life filled with purpose and meaning, with relationships that sustain and challenge me, with work that matters and dreams that are achievable. The letter I am writing to my son, to be opened when he turns 18, begins with the same words my grandmother used when she wrote to me. My dear child, it starts, I know you must have many questions, and I pray that I will have many more years to answer them in person. But if something should happen to me, I want you to know where you come from and who you are meant to be. You are the son of a man who was lost and found himself, the great-grandson of a woman who loved from a distance, the great-great-grandson of farmers who built something lasting from nothing but determination and faith. I tell him about the morning I aged out of the children's home, about the lawyer who appeared with a key and a letter, about the grandmother I never met who changed my life with her final gift. I described the fear and uncertainty I felt driving to a farm I had never seen, to claim an inheritance I had never expected, to meet a community that would become my family. I want him to understand that belonging is not something you are born with, but something you create through your choices and your commitments. The barn where his grandfather worked has become a symbol of transformation in our family story, a place where broken things are made whole, where dreams take shape in wood and metal, where the past and future come together in productive harmony. I teach my son to use the same tools his grandfather used, to respect the craftsmanship and creativity that went into every project, to understand that working with your hands is a form of prayer and meditation that connects you to something larger than yourself. As I watch him grow and learn, I see traces of his great-grandmother's determination, his grandfather's creativity, his great-grandfather's steady strength. He is the living embodiment of all the hopes and dreams that sustained my family through generations of struggle and triumph. In his laughter and curiosity and boundless energy, I see the future of the farm and the community we have worked so hard to build. The community that welcomed me as a lost teenager now celebrates him as their own, just as they will celebrate his sister when she arrives and any other children Sarah and I are blessed to have. He will grow up knowing that he belongs, that he is valued, that he has a place in the world that no one can take away from him. He will never experience the uncertainty and loneliness that shaped my early years, but he will understand through our stories how precious and fragile the gift of belonging really is. When visitors come to tour our farm and learn about our methods, I always tell them that our success is built on more than good soil and favorable weather and sound business practices. It is built on the foundation of love and sacrifice laid by people who came before us, on the support of neighbors who became family, on the understanding that we are all connected to each other and to the land we share. The key my grandmother left me was not just a piece of metal, but a symbol of trust, a belief that love can transcend death and distance and time. As my son approaches his third birthday and my daughter prepares to enter the world, I find myself thinking about the legacy I want to leave them. Not just the land and buildings and financial security, but the values and relationships and sense of purpose that have made my life meaningful. I want them to understand that they are part of something larger than themselves, that they have responsibilities as well as privileges, that the greatest satisfaction comes from serving others and building something that will outlast your own lifetime. The dining room table where we gather for meals has become the center of our family life, just as I hoped it would when I spent months crafting it from lumber grown on our own land. Around that table, we share stories and dreams, celebrate achievements, and comfort each other through disappointments. It is where my son will learn about his heritage and where my daughter will discover her place in our family story. It is where future generations will gather to remember those who came before and plan for those who are yet to come. If you are listening to this story and you feel lost or alone, if you are facing your own transition into adulthood without the support of family or community, I want you to know that belonging is possible for everyone. It may not come in the form of an unexpected inheritance or a letter from a grandmother you never met, but it will come if you are open to it, if you are willing to work for it, if you understand that family is not just about blood, but about the people who choose to love and support you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what dreams you are working toward. Share your own stories of finding belonging or creating family from friendship. Let me know if this story resonates with your own journey or inspires you to take risks in pursuit of something meaningful. I read every comment, and I am always amazed by the wisdom and courage of people who are building their own versions of home and community. The farm where I found my place in the world, it continues to evolve and grow, but its heart remains the same. It is a place where broken things are mended, where lost people find their way home, where the past and future come together in the eternal cycle of planting and harvesting, of seasons changing and generations passing the torch to those who will carry on their work. The key that unlocked my inheritance was small and simple, but it opened doors I never knew existed. It led me to a family I never knew I had, to a community that welcomed me with open arms, to work that feeds my soul as well as my body, to love that has transformed every aspect of my life. It taught me that we are all connected across time and space by invisible threads of love and hope and sacrifice. My grandmother's final gift was not just land and buildings and financial security. It was the chance to discover who I was meant to be, to find my place in a story that began long before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone. It was the opportunity to transform from an abandoned child into a man with roots and purpose in a future worth building. The letter she left me ended with a promise that has proven true in ways she could never have imagined. "You are not alone," she wrote. "You never were alone. You are part of a family and a community and a tradition that will sustain you through whatever challenges life may bring. The love that brought you to this moment will carry you forward to whatever comes next." As I tucked my son into the bed that once belonged to his great-grandmother in the room where she dreamed of the day she might meet him, I whispered the same promise to him. "You are not alone. You never will be alone. You are part of something beautiful and enduring, something built by generations of people who loved you before you were born and who will continue to love you long after they are gone." The barn stands silent in the moonlight, its doors open to the night air, no longer locked against painful memories, but welcoming to anyone who needs shelter or sanctuary. Inside, the workbenches hold new projects and old tools, evidence of work that continues and dreams that are always being born. The motorcycle sits ready for another ride, a connection to the past that brings joy in the present. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities, new chances to serve the community that has given me so much, new ways to honor the legacy of love that made my transformation possible. The fields will need tending, and the animals will need feeding, and the work of building something lasting will continue as it has for generations. But tonight, I am content to sit on the porch of the farmhouse where my grandmother lived and dreamed, watching the stars that shine down on land that has been in my family for generations, grateful beyond words for the key that unlocked not just a barn, but an entire life I never knew was possible. The boy who left the orphanage with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of questions has become a man with everything he ever needed, everything he never dared to hope for, everything that matters. The key was just the beginning. The real treasure was learning that home is not a place you find, but a place you create, one relationship at a time, one act of love at a time, one choice at a time, to believe that you belong exactly where you are.